Wherever you're listening in the world, it's a pleasure to welcome you to IsraelCast, the podcast powered by Jewish National Fund USA, your voice in Israel. I'm Stephen Shalowitz, first reminding you that for 120 years, Jewish National Fund USA has been the premier philanthropic movement for the land and people of Israel. While best known for planting trees in Israel, JNF USA contributes to Israeli life in so many ways, including community development in the Negev and the Galilee, preservation of heritage sites, supporting people with disabilities, and connecting high school and college students to Israel. To learn more and to see how you can contribute, do visit jnf.org. Once again, jnf.org. All right, as for this episode, I am so looking forward to my conversation with the one and only Amy Albertson. Now, Amy is a professional social media coach and Jewish activist. She's been an active voice in the Jewish and pro-Israel community for over 10 years now. And while living in Israel, she created the Instagram-based brand, The Asian Israeli, where she discusses her mixed identity and experiences as a Chinese-American Jewish woman. Through her explorations of her own identity, Amy gives other young Jews the tools to feel empowered to be unapologetically Jewish, both online and in their everyday lives, and even in the face of rising anti-Semitism and anti-Israel activity. And with that, it's a pleasure to welcome Amy Albertson to IsraelCast, who joins us now via Zoom from her California home office. Amy, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much for having me, Stephen. I am really excited to speak with you today.
I am as well. And we should share with our listeners, we had a very good laugh right before we started rolling here, because I had told you that you're the first interview that I'm doing post all the Chagim. I interviewed Gil Troy actually right after Rosh Hashanah and Tzom Gedalia, which happens to be my Hebrew birthday, by the way. I
Oh,
interviewed him
Mazal
then.
Tov.
Thank you. But you're the first one after all the Chagim, and you suggested that we should say a Shehachianu.
Yeah, if you want to.
So Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shechianu v'kimanu v'yanu lazman hazeh.
Amen, amen.
All right, and with
I
that,
love
we've
it.
inaugurated this new year of Israel Cast programming, and really can't think of a more appropriate person to have on the program to do that than, of course, Amy Albertson. And, you know, Amy, you first came to my attention as one of the voices featured in Ben M. Freeman's book, Jewish Pride. You have such an interesting background that I'd really love you to share it with us, and how you got to where you are today, which is speaking up for the Jewish people, for speaking up for Israel, for speaking out against Jew hatred, for speaking out against anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. Really take us back and share your background with us.
Sure. So I'm really happy, first of all, to hear that you discovered me from Ben's book. It was really such an honor to meet and work with Ben on his book, which I really recommend anyone reads. And no, he doesn't pay me to say that. I've read it and I bought it for my grandma, and I just really recommend it. But yeah, so my background, I grew up in California, where I am currently living. And I grew up in a mixed family. So my father is Jewish and my mother is Chinese American. Um, we were just very American mostly. The area that I grew up in is very diverse. Being in a mixed family was not out of the norm. And lots of people I grew up with were all different kinds of things. And so it was very American, I guess you could say, where there wasn't so much, like, we weren't very Chinese and we were certainly not very Jewish. Um, Judaism, I don't even like to say Judaism, but like Jewishness is was a very like loose thing in my upbringing. My father was really, he struggled with like his Jewish identity as a young person. He really didn't like feeling different or alienated, and in conjunction with just other hard things in his childhood, like he kind of strayed away from it, and it just wasn't something that he felt so compelled to be involved with or anything like that. And then my grandmother, who is the Jewish matriarch of our family, and I love her. She is very much she's like a strongly self-proclaimed atheist Jewish woman. So she's not big on religion at all, but she's a Jewish woman, and that's very important to her. And so I kind of just grew up with this Jewish identity of like, if someone asked me, what are you? I would say I'm half Jewish and I'm half Chinese, but I couldn't really even define what that meant because there wasn't that much Jewish stuff happening in my life. And whatever was happening was very different, I found out later in life, from what other Jews may have been experiencing. For example, I grew up celebrating Passover, but we did not read a Haggadah, and I didn't know what a Haggadah was until college.
How
But
did
we
you
did
celebrate
read.
Passover then?
We would gather and have, and have a dinner, and I believe we called it a seder. We had a seder plate, and we had all the things, but about um, we read a different book that was not a religious text that told the story of the Exodus and why the Jews celebrate Passover and what the different things on the Seder plate are. And we ate food together.
Amy, that sounds
And
like a Haggadah to me.
it, right, but it wasn't a religious text, I guess. So, but it basically, it's the same thing, right? It tells the story. Um, and the whole spirit of like learning the story and being together and the tradition was there, right? But it was just a very different thing. Like I didn't hear Hebrew prayers until I was a grown up either.
So you didn't
Things
have
like
a bat
this.
mitzvah, for example.
I didn't, and it's interesting because my dad had what he calls a secular bar mitzvah. Torah wasn't really involved. He just had like a little gathering, and like he gave some speech, and I never had heard of a bar bat mitzvah for most of my life. And then when I was around 10 or 11, my grandma asked me if I wanted to have a bat mitzvah, and I was like, I don't know, do I? And I was like, what is that? And she's like, ask your dad. So I asked my dad, Dad, grandma wants to know if I want to have a bat mitzvah. Like, what is that? She said to ask you. And he's like, oh, well, I had to like learn some things and give a speech in front of everyone. And I was, hard to believe, a very shy child. So I was like, oh no, that sounds terrible. No, thank you. Little did I know, actually, in America, you have a big party and get lots of money. So I missed out. And yeah,
But you're making up for it.
I suppose I am. And I was actually considering so I just turned 30 this year.
Congrats.
That's a whole thing, but thank
Been
you.
there, been there, done that,
Um,
Amy.
right. So, it's not as bad as people say.
It's not.
But yes, so I had considered having like an adult bat mitzvah for my 30th birthday, but then I turned 30 in the pandemic, so that didn't happen. Maybe I'll shoot for 40, like
No,
Tiffany Haddish, and have a comedy
I
special.
think what you should do, Amy, is you shoot for 36 because it's double high.
Oh, that's such a good point. And I mean, it's pretty close to 40 anyway, but yeah, I always joked that, because I did dabble in a little, we're getting off topic, but I did dabble in a little, stand-up comedy while living in Israel. And so I always joked that, like Tiffany Haddish had her comedy special Black Mitzvah for her 40th birthday, and she had an adult bat mitzvah, that I would do the same, and also have a comedy special. I don't know if it would be on Netflix, but you know.
Listen, we have a very varied audience, so you never know who's listening to the show. They might just reach out to Amy and say, Amy, we've got a deal for you.
I hope Tiffany Haddish is listening to this, and I hope that she will open for me at my bat mitzvah.
Listen, as long as I get an invitation, Amy, from your mouth to God's ear, right? So what was that
Yes.
moment like for you, Amy? And when was that moment for you where it was you went from sort of Amy Albertson, American girl, to Amy Albertson, I'm embracing Judaism and I'm really digging this whole Israel thing?
Sure. So, interestingly enough, I think it started a lot during high school when I went to Catholic high school. I went to Catholic high school because in the place I grew up, those were the good high schools. The only private college prep high schools were Catholic. So I asked my parents, can I go to this high school? And I went there. And that's when I started to learn more about religion and not only Catholicism, obviously, but like this was a pretty liberal Catholic high school. I find out as I learn about more Catholic high schools, and we learned about different world religions. My teachers were not nuns or priests. We were mixed boys and girls. But so I started to learn more about religion. And the more I learned about Catholicism, the more I had a lot of thoughts about my own maybe spirituality, and that pointed to what I knew I had, which was Jewish roots. So I became more interested in that. And then once I went to college, college is the natural place. You're on your own. You can kind of do what you want. And it's not that my parents wouldn't let me find a Jewish community or anything like that. It's just like, it was before Google was like such a thing, or, iPhones were brand new when I was like a senior. So, it was a little bit more difficult for like a child to go seek out a Jewish community if I had wanted to. But in high school, I went to Hillel. And
in high school, you did?
No, in college. So once I went to college, I went to, it was when I was like, okay, I had this thing in high school where I'm starting to feel curious more, to learn more about my Jewish roots and what it means to be Jewish and all these things. So my first stop in college was Hillel, and I quickly made, people who became my best friends throughout all of college. I've always been pretty quick to get involved. So I quickly got involved with, the student board at Hillel. I eventually became the president. But another thing that I did when I started to get involved in Jewish life was I went to different synagogues in Portland, and I met with different rabbis. So I went to Portland State University, and once I started to be eager to learn more about being Jewish, I decided to contact different synagogues and meet with different rabbis. So I met with a few different rabbis, and one in particular, his name is Rabbi Zuckerman. I honestly don't even know where in the world he is now and what he's doing, but Rabbi Zuckerman is the first, like, my rabbi that I had. I would call him like my rabbi.
Amy, there's something called Google,
I know, but he's very elusive. He's not on social media. He had retired from the shul even before I made Aliyah. Spoiler alert. And yeah, so, but Rabbi Zuckerman, he was like, we immediately like connected. The first thing he did was just like, okay, you want to learn? And he gave me books right off his bookshelf. And I eventually met the youth director there, and I started working with her, and it all just kind of snowballed from there. I became, all my friends were Jewish. I was involved with Jewish life on campus. I was, getting involved with this synagogue and working with the youth at the synagogue and learning, from them and with them because I was at their level. And it was great.
And then what resonated for you about Judaism in Israel at that point?
So at that point with Judaism, it was just like, I'm not even sure. It's hard to explain, right? Because it's like a feeling that I had inside, I guess you could say. But it just felt right and good. And also for everything that I didn't know, or everything I didn't experience, there was enough connection or things that I did experience that just made me feel like, oh, these are my people. Like, they get it. Even things like having skin conditions or something that, like, none of my friends had eczema. None of my Asian friends certainly had it. But then I met all of these Jewish people, and, 50% of my friends have eczema too. And I'm like, oh, that makes sense. My dad has it, I have it, and you have it. Great. You get it. So that kind of thing. And then when it comes to Israel, so that's like another interesting story is I didn't really start to be like so concerned with Israel until we got an Israeli shaliach in Portland. And that was my second year at Portland State.
Look, growing up, year, Amy? About which year?
What year in the calendar?
Yeah.
Oh, 2000. 11 maybe.
Okay.
I think 2010 or 11, something like that. I feel old. Um,
Listen, you're just 30. For those of us that are beyond 30, you're not old. Let me reassure you.
right, right. So yeah, in I think it was around 2011, my second year at Portland State, the Jewish Federation of Greater Portland decided to bring a shaliach. So for anyone who doesn't know, a shaliach is it translates to emissary, and they're Israelis who the Jewish Agency or other organizations send around to different communities, and they basically, do a lot of different types of jobs, but they create sort of connections between the community and Israel. So Amos, who is a dear friend of mine to this day, came to Portland and we became very good friends. And he brought a movie about Israel to my college campus. Very apolitical movie, nothing to do with Palestinians or Palestine or politics even. And it was protested. And I had no idea what was going on. My context of Israel was Israel's a Jewish country, just like there are other countries, with different religions or whatever. And we like Israel because we're Jewish, and that's it. I had no idea about anything. And I go, and it gets protested. And I was like, what's going on? Like, what's happening? Why do these people hate us? Like, what? Why are they protesting this movie? Like, it's a really good movie. They didn't even watch it. And that's when I was like, Amos, please, can we have a coffee so I can learn about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? And of course, he said yes, but also chuckled a little bit because obviously one coffee is not enough to learn about the entire Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But that was kind of like the spark that lit the fire, you could say, of me becoming, if you ask my friends, obsessed with Israel and learning everything about Israel, the good, the bad, the ugly, the food, the people, the music.
And so then when was that decision for you to move to Israel? When did that happen, Amy?
So there's a long a long journey between me becoming obsessed with Israel and moving there. So I started off, basically my relationship with Israel started off with learning about Israel through the Israelis I encountered, like Amos, or I started becoming an activist. Basically, not immediately, but in response to that event, I ended up starting an Israel group on my college campus and somehow became the face of like Jewish students and pro-Israel activity in Portland. And through that, I met a lot of different people like Chen Mazig, and I met him when he was in Seattle and I was doing activity on college campus. And
whom we had here on the program.
Yes, Chen is a dear friend and a mentor of mine. And so I experienced Israel through learning, research, books. I also changed my major and started doing a Judaic studies minor to learn about Israel. And I had, my Israeli friends and my Jewish friends who had gone to Israel. And eventually I went on a birthright. I went on a birthright trip my last summer of Israel. And I stayed 2.5 months after my birthright trip and just traveled around by myself and hung out and visited Amos and Chen and different Israelis and just soaked it up. And I was just in love with Israel and Israelis. And I then went back, finished my last semester, and went on a Masa program after that. I did an internship in Tel Aviv for 6 months. And then I went home and was like, what do I do now? I guess I need to start my adult life. Where do I want to do that? And Israel was just calling my name. So 6 months later, I made Aliyah.
Now, during this whole process and during the time that you were preparing to make Aliyah, what was your family saying? Were they encouraging you? Were they saying, Amy, you're crazy? What did your grandmother say? Your father say?
So it's very interesting. So my parents actually did visit me in Israel when I was on my Masa program, and that was their first time visiting Israel. And they saw me in Israel. So I think they knew before I did that I was probably going to move there. But, obviously they had to let me figure that out in my own time. They're very encouraging. I'm very lucky that my parents have always been so encouraging of everything I do. Um, my grandma was actually like, she was like, Amy, the rabbinute is just so oppressive. Why would you want to move there? But she's also very proud of me. And she did come visit me when I lived there as well.
Was that her first
And then
visit?
no, she visited in the 70s. So obviously it was very different. um, and so, yeah, so she was also very proud, even though she has a lot of, but look, like we all have our criticisms of Israel, right? So, um, and then the rest of my family, like especially my non-Jewish family, just doesn't really know that much about Israel, like the way that most people just don't know anything about Israel, right? They asked me things like, what kind of shots do you need to get before you go? My little cousins were like, do you have YouTube there? Do you have indoor plumbing? Things like this. And I'm like, whoa, where do you think I'm going? This is the high tech capital of the Middle East. Like, we invented the stuff that's inside your iPhone. Um, yeah, so it was like a very interesting reaction from my family
From your
and my
family?
friends.
Right. Before we get on to what you did in Israel and your sense of being a Zionist, I want to ask you though, just and if you can respond just really briefly about your Chinese side of the family, because I was actually trained as a China specialist. My bachelor's was in Chinese language and literature. My master's was in international relations, focusing on China. I lived in China for 7 years. I lived in Singapore for 9 years, and on and on. And I feel such an affinity towards the Chinese people. And I think Jews and Chinese are very similar. Both are ancient peoples, long literary traditions. Both peoples value education, family, hard work. And so there's a natural connection, I think, between Jews and Chinese. And I'm just wondering, from your perspective, how much of that Chinese heritage did you embrace when you were young or even embrace even today?
Sure. So it's interesting because, so first of all, like I said, my family was very American, and there's like such a difference between Chinese people from China and Chinese Americans. Like we're largely not even accepted as like Chinese by people who are from China. They call us, things like ABC, American born Chinese, or banana, which is like yellow on the outside, white on the inside. And and so it's first and foremost important to like point out that my family is very American. My Chinese family is more generations American than my Jewish family. And so it's not that we don't do Chinese things or we don't have Chinese culture. It's that we are very American in that way. But that being said, once I moved to Israel, I learned how Asian I was because there were not very many Asian people around me. And then there's all these things that I do or wanted or craved that like people just didn't understand or they had never heard of or never did. Um, so definitely as I grew into this exploration of, my Jewish heritage and the Jewish people and Jewish culture, I definitely have neglected learning about my Chinese side. At some point, I realized that, and I did go and ask my family, where are we from, and things like this. And I still have a lot more to do. But as far as like Chinese from China stuff, you can school me for sure. I've never been to China. I don't speak Chinese. My grandparents speak Cantonese as it is. So the few things I know are people are like, oh, that's so lucky. And I'm like, well, not really. Um, and, but yeah, sometimes I do have like a little guilt about it, like that maybe I've neglected that half of myself.
Well, Amy, life is long, and you certainly have. I mean, you're only 30, so there's certainly time to learn
Right.
about that. It's interesting what you said, though, about feeling Asian when you were in Israel, because I had always been a practicing Jew. I went to day school. I came from a practicing family. However, when I moved to Asia, I felt my sense of Jewishness was heightened because of the
Mm-hmm.
lack of Jews there. And that's probably the
Mm-hmm.
same sensation that you had in Israel because of the lack of Asians that are indeed in Israel. So I think that's actually a very natural thing to happen. So you get to Israel, and then just real briefly, what were you doing in Israel? And then I want to talk about your whole Zionistic experience.
Sure. So, when I first got to Israel, I did an Ulpan, like a Hebrew program, subsidized by the government, and I was there for 6 months. And eventually, I went to work for Jewish nonprofits doing digital marketing. I worked for Masa for almost 2 years. I worked for what's now Open Door Media, which was then Jerusalem U, and yeah, so I lived in Jerusalem for 3 years working in nonprofits. And then I decided to move to Tel Aviv and move to for profit and high tech. And so that was, I kind of had like a half and half full spectrum Israeli life.
And then what made you decide to move back to the US?
um, I decided to move back to the US ultimately for a couple the biggest reasons were one, my family lives in America and I have no family in Israel. So just the thought of like, okay, am I going to live away from my family like this forever? Was really hard for me. And the other thing was living in Israel is very hard. And I think that, especially as Americans who maybe consider moving to Israel, it's very much more an ideological choice for us than it might be for other Olim, say from, the former Soviet Union or, Beta Israel Jews from Ethiopia or things like this, where it's like they don't have choices like we do. Israel is the one country that they can move to and become citizens, and there's economic opportunities that are better than in their home country. And so, um, living in Israel is not easy. And I was, alone. Not that I didn't have amazing friends who were, very dear to me, but I was alone, and I just kind of realized that I do love Israel, but I don't need to be living there. And I wasn't going to live there forever. And once I decided I wasn't going to live there forever, it was kind of like, well, when do you leave then? And turning 30 and a pandemic were a really good opportunity to start the next chapter of my life. So here we are.
I like that answer. You know it when you know it. When I moved to Asia, I said, I don't know how long I'm going to stay. And I had
Mm-hmm.
several thoughts during my 16 years living there that I would return back at different points, but it just never panned out. And at one point I said, okay, I'm
Mm-hmm.
drawing the line in the sand. So I know what you mean because you just know it when you
Yeah.
know it. Right. And part
Mm-hmm.
of the impetus for me to move back was to be closer to my family as well. So I totally get that, Amy. And you know what? You can divide your time. We know you're still going to be visiting Israel. And of course, you have a very deep connection and association to Israel. And as you know, Amy, Jewish National Fund USA has launched a year-long campaign called Conversations on Zionism,
Mm-hmm.
Reclaiming the Narrative. And I'd like to go there now with you. And you've been a part of that. And we encourage everyone that's listening right now to go to youtube.com/Zionism Studios to see these really enlightening conversations. We'll talk in a sec about your participation, but I'd like to know
Sure.
first, really, Amy, your definition of Zionism.
Sure. So Zionism, like, I feel like it's just conflated or inflated into like this big, crazier thing than it actually is. But for me, it's very basic. It is the Jewish people's right to self determination in our indigenous homeland. Now, obviously, it can take many different forms and offshoots of types of Zionism and different ideologies that can be built off of this. But at the end of the day, I think that's really what it is. Um, and I think that sometimes we find it hard, maybe or we think it's hard to define it because it's been, you know, made into this controversial thing, but honestly, it's not that controversial.
I like it. Plain and simple from Amy Albertson there. Well, Amy, you were on a panel called Jews Talking Justice, which once again can be viewed at youtube.com/Zionism Studios. And I encourage once again everyone to check that out. And I saw you too on a master class, which was titled, you didn't know that I was there, but I was there. You
I
gave a
didn't.
master, you didn't because we didn't know each other. But and you, by the way, came to New York recently, and I wish that I had seen you here so I could meet you in
Yeah,
person.
I'm sorry.
That's okay. Next time we can take the photo op so that we can post it to help promote this interview. But anyway, but that'll
Yeah.
be for another time. But how do you like that? But anyway, but you did give a master class. It was called Being Jewish Unapologetically: How You Can Be an Empowered, Strong, Proud Zionist Online and Beyond. And one of the key takeaways, and by the way, it was an amazing hour plus. So really congratulations to you. But one of the key takeaways I took, Amy, from that is something that we certainly do here regularly on IsraelCast. And that's we share our pride in Zionism, our love and pride in Israel every day and with each new episode, and not just when Israel is on the defensive. And I'd love
Mhm.
you to build on that thought about sharing one's love and passion for Israel on a daily basis.
Sure. I think it's really important to note because I think, unfortunately and surprisingly, I've been getting more pushback for this sort of methodology or ideology that I've kind of moved into, which is the whole idea of basing my activism or my outspokenness in proactivity and positivity versus reaction. Um, and it comes from just spending, 10 plus years in this work, in this fight, so to speak, where I've observed mostly young people and the majority of my activity is online. So I think that's important to note the context. But I see that a lot of young Jewish people, especially, are starting to feel like their Jewishness is a burden or an anxiety and they need to hold it a secret. They're afraid to tell someone that they're Jewish or that they go to Israel or they're Zionist because they're afraid of the reaction they'll get from people. And I myself am guilty of having this. And through realizing that, I realized it has a lot to do with the fact that we constantly consume negative information. We constantly consume anti-Semitism, and a lot of the times that people are speaking up is only in reaction to anti-Semitic events or the last escalation in Gaza. We saw the internet, for lack of a better term, blowing up with that's really terrible. We saw the activity really going up online, and a lot of people told me, like, I don't want to talk about being Jewish because I'm afraid of what people will say, or I'm afraid my friends will not want to be my friends anymore, and all of these kinds of things. And that really just it makes me so upset for myself and for other young Jewish people. So, and also it's really bad for us from a perspective of like mental health. And I'm not a psychologist, so I don't know that I have the right terminology exactly, but I see two things. One, the outside world's reaction to us only being reactionary is like, okay, well, I only know about Jews in this context. So if they're getting really defensive about something, maybe there's something there. Like, why are they being defensive? Right? If that's all that you see. And then the other half of that is just for ourselves, that like if our Jewishness is rooted in fear of anti-Semitism and reaction to negative things all the time, we end up with what I see happening, which is, feeling that your Jewishness is a burden. And it's not. Like Ben Freeman says in his book, and it's just something that I just so truly believe, is anti-Semitism is not a Jewish problem. It is a non-Jewish problem that we unfortunately bear the consequences of.
I'm going to talk about that in just a sec, but I want to share a story with you just real briefly.
Hmm.
I had worked, as I mentioned, in Singapore for many years. I worked in advertising and on radio. And one of my colleagues in advertising is one of the smartest strategists that I know. I don't want to mention his name. He's originally from India, lives in Singapore.
Hmm.
And he would always ask me questions about Israel, uh, probing, but just very curious more than anything else. And it
Hmm.
wasn't that he was ever anti-Israel or he was pro whatever. He was anti. He's just an intensely curious individual. And I would explain the Israel story to him, and then he would counter, and I would explain. But we would have healthy conversations, is what I mean.
Hmm.
So he sees that I'm posting the interviews from IsraelCast with, for example, high tech leaders, leaders in water, people in the culinary arts, etc. And I would say this was about 2 years ago. He sends me a text after one of the interviews went up, and he said, I listened to the interview. I didn't know any of this. And now I really want to go to Israel and check it out for myself. Okay. And I share that with you, and I share that with our listeners, that we have to share what's going on in Israel, the beauty of Israel. We have to share,
Hmm.
again, just the many, many facets and not be defensive. And we should be proud of our people and of our heritage. And Amy, for the life of me, I can't understand it when people have absolutely, that are Jewish, that have absolutely
Hmm.
no curiosity about Israel or
Hmm.
no understanding, but yet they'll go and rush to understand everything else. Um,
Hmm.
it boggles my mind. And I have many friends, dare I say, like that. I don't know if they listen to the show, so I'm not offending them. So there you go. But in any event, but I want to pick up on something that Ben said, because
Hmm.
so here I am today. I'm eating lunch several hours ago before we started recording this, minding my own business, and I'm flicking through Facebook, and I see a article from the Allgemeiner. And I don't know if you saw
Hmm.
it today or not, but this is, as we record this today, this episode is going up in a couple of weeks. So it's just recording it today. And the article was titled A New Tack for US Jews Fighting Anti-Semitism, the quote, "You're Dead to Me" strategy. It was written by Benjamin Kirstein. And I'd love to read just a little bit of that article, a paragraph or so.
Hmm.
So bear with me, because I'd love you to comment on it, because it very much
Sure.
relates to what Ben says in his book, which you just articulated so well. So what Benjamin wrote here is, quote, "The strategy that a new establishment should adopt then is a quote unquote, you're dead to me strategy. It should go to the progressive and Muslim communities and to make it absolutely clear that until they start dealing effectively with anti-Semitism in their communities, they will get nothing from American Jews. No votes, no money, no political support, no interfaith solidarity, nothing. Let's see how they do without us. The "you're dead to me" strategy should be coupled with another positive strategy, a quote, "we ourselves" strategy, according to which the various resources that have gone to progressive causes and interfaith efforts will be redirected to the Jewish community itself to be used for everything from securing Jewish sites to forming self-defense groups to funding efforts to promote Jewish identity and pride." Once again, the author of that is Benjamin Kirstein. He wrote that in the Allgemeiner. And I'm just wondering if you can comment on that, Amy, and related to that, have you noticed a generational difference in the response to Jew hatred, anti-Semitism, and anti-Zionism? Your generation versus the older generation, let's call them.
Okay, so we have a lot to unpack here. I don't know this person, so come for me on Twitter if you want, but I really disagree with the first half of what they're saying. I don't think breaking ties with as much as as much as I can agree that we don't get allies as easily as other groups or other causes, I really, really do not think that breaking ties with those communities until like giving them this ultimatum is like the way to go. I think that fighting anti Semitism is 100% a part of the greater fight in this world against things like white supremacy and other types of racism and bigotry. Um, and it's hard because we are so small and we don't seem to receive the support that others do. But I just really don't agree with that sentiment. It's self-isolating, and also as Jewish people, I think that we have always historically fought for justice for other people, and I think we should continue. I don't see why we should stop, because it's not that we do it for something in exchange, right? I had a teacher in high school who told me the definition of a gift is when you give something but you're not expecting something in return. And I think that that's a big part of being Jewish, right? Like, we fight for justice regardless. We don't fight for justice so that we can have it back from someone else. There's obviously lines, right? There's obviously limits to this. If you decide to become anti-Semitic, then of course we are no longer going to be partnering with you. But I'm not sure that I really feel comfortable or can agree with that
Well,
idea.
I think his point was that you have people on the left, progressives, that have become very anti-Semitic, and you have people in the
Mhm.
Muslim community. We're not suggesting all progressives, we're not suggesting all in the Muslim community, but the example that he actually gave in the article, which came out uh, today or yesterday, October 12th or 13th,
Mhm.
what happened in the British Labour Party, where
Mhm.
certainly not everyone in the British Labour Party was anti-Semitic, but there was certainly a very vocal segment of the British Labour Party that was, and Jews left and said, we're not supporting you.
Mhm.
And so it's this notion of how do you, or the question I should say is, how do you make those groups realize that they are
Mhm.
full of Jew hatred? There are people in them that are really anti-Semitic, that are really anti-Zionist. So how do you make them see that it is a problem? And how do you then foster that change within those groups?
Mhm.
Because we can very
Sure.
well say it, and I agree with Ben, we can say it, but how do you make the change then?
Sure. I think it's really important that you pointed out that not everyone within these groups are anti Semitic, that it has infiltrated it. So when it becomes, I'm not 100% well versed in the situation with the Labor Party. I know on a very surface level. So I see that the Labor Party has been infiltrated in such a strong way, and that the rest of the Labor Party seems very indifferent to what is happening. Therefore, yes, I would say, okay, as a Jew, I can no longer support this party. I'd say when we want to take it in comparison to other examples, for example, I mean, you mentioned the Muslim community, where I just think that I see so much in opposition to the Muslim community who are extremists or who are, encouraging anti-Semitic rhetoric. For every one of those, I do see, plenty of other interfaith connections and allyship and things like this. But also, we want to say, let's take the example of the Squad in the Democratic Party, right? So the Squad does something like try to defund the Iron Dome, and it becomes this big news story about how Democrats are defunding the Iron Dome. And that's completely wrong, because the greater Democratic Party, the true Democratic Party, supports Israel. Historically, both sides of the aisle have supported Israel. There are, of course, outliers in both parties. And the Squad comes in, 8 people, to try to make us think or feel otherwise. And that's not true. In the conference I was just at, Representative Richie Torres, who I'm a big fan of, and I'm guessing if you're from New York that you know of him.
Oh, sure.
Great ally to the Jewish community, great ally to
I
Israel.
want to get him on this show and my other podcast.
You
You'll,
definitely should. He's
you'll have to
amazing.
make
He
that happen,
has.
Amy.
I don't really have the connection. I tweeted about him and he didn't even like it, so I don't
Well,
know. Um,
I think Chen Masig is friends with him, so I'll have to ask Chen.
yeah, yeah. Ask Khan. He definitely has an
Yeah.
in.
So what did Richie say about that? Because I have my own thoughts, but I'd like to hear what Richie said.
Sure.
I'm calling
So
him Richie
Richie,
like I know him, but
yeah. So Representative Torres, he is a true, what I would call, So just as like, AOC or Rashida Tlaib or any of these people will call themselves progressive candidates, I see Representative Torres as he is a true progressive at his core, and he recognizes that Israel, that the Jewish people face anti-Semitism. He recognizes that Israel has the right to exist and defend itself, all of these things. And so that's when, we just we have to kind of parse through the sensationalizing of things like the Democrats are trying to defund the Iron Dome and then read into it and say, oh, no, the Democrats are not trying to. The squad is trying to. And they are not in line with, one, the rest of the party, and they are not a majority, and no one is taking their, I was about to say BS, but I'm not sure if this
You
is
can say
the place
it.
for that. But
Yeah.
okay, so that's not the place for their BS, and we see through it. And I think that's something that comes with, like I was saying before, is a lot of, this comes from a place of like fear and reaction, versus a place of, it's just like when you're in a place of fear and you're already like quick to react to things, we see that headline and we automatically are blasting it out and we're automatically like getting worried. But honestly, I don't want to say it's not as bad as we think it is. Like, definitely anti-Semitism a growing problem in a lot of spaces. But I think it's from a place where we need to think about how we approach it, because a lot of times we just take it to Twitter and like start yelling at that person and shaming them and doxing them. And, we want to cancel them for anti-Semitism. And that is not good.
Yeah. Before we talk about some tools and some things that people can do and to keep it positive, I will say, though, that when Ilhan Omar came out with some very anti-Semitic tropes, and I don't even want to repeat what they are, she was not censored. And
No.
that anyone else would have been censored, number one. And there was a resolution condemning anti-Semitism that went before the House, which is democratically controlled, and they would not pass it. Instead, they watered it down to call it a anti-everything. Let's just, throwing everything in the kitchen sink. So the fact that Nancy Pelosi, and believe me, Amy, I do not get political on this show, but I think it needs to be underscored that they did not censor Ilhan Omar, and Nancy Pelosi did not orchestrate that resolution condemning anti-Semitism. That, to me, is beyond reprehensible. And the fact that the media gives so much attention to the squad and are making them out to be these heroes. And there are so many people out there that are so uneducated about issues. That, to me, I think they are a cancer. And that, to me, is really, really scary in terms of their rhetoric and their support, and how everyone in, whether it's academia or Hollywood, the media, the corporate world, are leaning in that direction. Why? Because they're afraid of them. So that is very much of a story we have to watch out, because they are really cancerous. And I mean, it's no secret AOC is going to run for, or she wants to take Chuck Schumer's Senate seat here in New York. I hope and pray every day that that does not happen, nor do I think it will happen. But the fact that she can galvanize so many people, to me, is actually very scary. So I'm going to get off my soapbox now. I think, Amy, in the 4.5 years I've done the show, I think I've never gotten on a soapbox, but there's a first for everything. And we said a shahachiyanu at the beginning of the show. So maybe this is the start of a whole new thing. So let's just talk in the time that we have remaining about a couple of points. But the first is, if you can just really briefly share with our wonderful audience around the world some things that the average person can do online, because that's your expertise, just to really get the beauty of Israel out, and the beauty of Zionism out, and the beauty of Judaism out there for the rest of the world to enjoy, embrace, and understand.
Sure. Yeah. So like, it's not, not everyone needs to be an activist, right? I don't think, and I don't really, if you want to do that, I encourage you to do that, but I don't really encourage people to become me, I guess you could say, like where all I talk about almost all the time is like being Jewish or Israel or anti-Semitism or these things. I think it's just about being Jewish is a part of who you are just as much as any of those other parts of who you are. So in the realm of like social media, treat it that way, right? So I'm mostly speaking to a younger, maybe millennial audience or Gen Z audience, right? Like I show my morning coffee because I drink coffee every morning. That's part of what I do. So on Shabbat, I say Shabbat Shalom, and it's just a thing. Not all of my followers are Jewish. And I think it's things like that where it's just bring your Jewishness to your social media presence the same way that you exist in the world as a Jewish person. You know, maybe when you're having conversations with people, you don't mention things like, oh, this weekend I had Shabbat dinner at my parents. It was really nice, because you don't think they'll know what Shabbat is. You don't want them to know you're Jewish. I don't know, whatever the reason. Just say it. Say it. And then maybe that person's going to say, oh, Shabbat dinner. That's like a Jewish thing, right? I didn't know you were Jewish. Yeah, I'm Jewish. And we do Shabbat dinner. It's actually this thing. We do it every week. It's really nice. And we have dinner together and we say these little prayers and la, 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 blah, 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 what it is. And people will now know a little positive, cool thing about Jewish people and know that they know a Jewish person on a personal level. And that is so helpful when it comes to things like when they hear something anti-Semitic, to feel a little more inclined to question it or say something about it. Or, you talk about, like, I was very nervous to tell people I moved here from Israel. I just got back from living in Israel for 6 years, and people want to know, what did you do? Why were you there? Or, I was at a party with my childhood friend who is not Jewish and not related to Israel at all. And there was a guy there who just found out from his DNA test that he's Palestinian. He's adopted and he found out he's Palestinian. And so upon hearing that I moved back from Israel, he immediately was like, so why do you hate Palestinian people? And I was like, I don't know you. And me living in Israel has nothing to do with that. But so that made me scared, right, to say that. But I learned that more often than not, if I just tell someone I lived in Israel, or, I post something about Israel, or I missed this thing from Israel, or whatever, generally nothing happens. And I actually get people responding saying like, oh, that's a cool thing. I didn't know that. And so then the next time that they see anti-Israel things, they ask more questions. Yeah. And they aren't so quick to just post something. They might not speak up for Israel yet or ever, but they are asking the question, and they are not as quick, or they won't post misinformation. And I think that that's just so important.
I love the whole notion, Amy, of wishing people a Shabbat Shalom on social media. Hashtag Shabbat Shalom, you show a cool picture. I love the whole notion also of inviting people over for a Shabbat dinner to experience it and what it's all about. And I have many non-Jewish friends, but they all know about Judaism. Believe me, I'm not patting myself on the back, but they know, because when I was working in advertising, I would take off for the holidays or whatever it was. Or even for Purim, for example, I would bring in Hamantaschen to the office and whatever it is. And I think it's just showing part of your cultural heritage and who you are, the person. And why should we be afraid to talk about who we are as people? I mean, we have 4,000 years of a history. And yeah. I mean, and that's why I say it just boggles the mind when you have some people that are just so afraid to even like dip a toe in there, because they're afraid of not being accepted. Just start dipping the toe in, and soon your whole body will be submerged in water, just like in a mikvah. How do you like that for another ecumenical analogy?
Exactly.
We're just coming up with them here. But I love that whole idea of the whole Shabbat Shalom thing. Just one or two other points, Amy, though. I want to circle back, though, to this notion of something that Ben Freeman, I think, also talks about, and I believe you've touched on in some of your talks, this whole notion of other communities should not define us and who we are.
Hmm.
We need to define ourselves. Don't tell me who I am. And I would love you to weigh in on that, because I think that that's such a powerful message.
Sure. I think it's very important. Um, and again, I don't know why for Jews it seems to be that much more difficult, but I think it's important for any
You
group
know
of
why? I think
people.
because Jews especially want to be accepted.
Sure, sure, probably because of that, but I mean more of the pushback of I think it's important that any group is the one that defines themselves. Um, and I think part of the reason it's so important for the Jewish people, especially, I mean, it's always been this way, but especially now, is that there is so much, you know, misinformation and all of this anti-Semitic, all these tropes and things about us that are out there, and they're wrong. So it's just so important that people know who we really are. And then also when it comes to things like Zionism, that we are the ones who define it. Because, like I said, it's been conflated into this controversial thing, but it's really not that controversial. It's actually quite progressive, and it's actually pretty basic. And it's been conflated into something, bad and controversial. And that is because it's being redefined by other people for us. And then we are internalizing it to the extent of now, of course, it's still very much a minority, but you have anti-Zionist Jews or Jews who are saying, well, we just need to divorce, being Jewish and Judaism with Zionism or with the land of Israel. And it's like, I don't know which Torah you're reading, but I just really don't think that's going to be possible. And it shouldn't be, necessary. It shouldn't be necessary.
Maybe, Amy, they were reading from the Torah just like you were reading from that so-called Haggadah years ago, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know.
Maybe it was by the same publisher there.
I don't know. I mean, even my atheist grandmother is very Zionist. So, I don't know where they're getting this from. But yeah, I just think it's really important that we define our own terms, because also then you have things like Jews get gaslit a lot more, right? About anti-Semitism. We say that was anti-Semitic, and people will say, I don't know. I don't think so. And it's just like, who are you to tell me that that wasn't anti-Semitic? And when it's not 100% this way, but more often I face a lot less pushback if I talk about Asian racism than I do about anti-Semitism. Less questions. And I don't know if that's because people think they know more about Asians in America, or people are more exposed to Asians, or they think they're more exposed to Asians than they are Jews. But people definitely question whether or not something is anti-Semitic much more than they will question something anti-Asian.
And why do you think that's so, Amy?
I think it has to do with just like, well, it's two things. I think one, it is that people are just unfamiliar with Jewish people or anti-Semitic tropes. This was something that my colleagues and I discussed at the conference a lot, which was that people don't know anti-Semitic tropes, but anti-Asianness comes in, actually, to be honest, it has a lot of overlap with anti-Semitic tropes, but one of the, like, it's mostly like, you're foreign, go back to where you came from, and now it's the whole thing about you brought COVID to the country and blah, blah, blah. So they kind of can know where to identify it. So I guess maybe they feel more comfortable to accept it, whereas anti-Semitic tropes have been twisted and embedded into our societies in so many different ways that it's not so straightforward, in which case it can appear not, people can't see that I'm making air quotes, but like, quote unquote, not anti-Semitism, right? Like, oh, it's anti-Zionism, not anti-Semitism, where it's like, no, it is anti-Semitism, and they've transformed it and defined it and turned it into this thing that makes you think that you're opposing a country's government or a country, but really you're not. You are talking about Jewish people. You are saying the Jewish people do not have the same rights as everyone else. And, you're characterizing Jews as something that they're not. So I think maybe that's where it comes from.
Got it. Well, listen, Amy, as we wind down our conversation, this has been really such a fascinating chat with you, and I really hope to have you back on the program. But as we wind down our conversation, I just want to leave on an Israeli note. And you lived in Israel, of
Sure.
course. Do you have a couple of your favorite things you'd recommend for anyone going to Israel for the first or the 15 millionth time?
Oh my goodness, that's like a
Anything on the Amy Albertson list?
that is like a very big question.
And that's why I asked it,
Um,
Amy. I only ask big questions
okay.
here on IsraelCast.
So the best falafel in Tel Aviv is Hakosem for sure. And I asked lots of Tel Avivians where they think it is. That is some of the best falafel. That's the best falafel in Tel Aviv. Obviously you can go out to the periphery to get other things. I don't I don't know. I mean, I feel like I don't know. I don't know that I know it better than other people. This is bad. I'm really embarrassing myself. Let me think about this.
Listen, no, Amy, actually, it's good that you're pausing here because it just means probably you had a lot of experiences that were phenomenal, and they're all just sort of competing for Amy's top list.
I mean, yeah, it's true. Like, I just feel like also it's all relative, right? Like, since I've been back in America, I
Mhm.
think that eating any hummus or any almost any falafel or hummus is just so good comparatively. But yeah, so the best falafel in Tel Aviv is Hakosem. I think Shuk Makne Yehuda is better than Shuk HaCarmel. That might be controversial. The best sufganiyot, if you're going to Israel for Hanukkah, I personally love them from Kadosh in Jerusalem. Roladin is overrated. And what else?
And the best rugelach is from marzipan, right? In
Yes, and that is a yes, and that's a universal truth, and people are correct about that. But
Right. Oh,
yeah,
right.
I think those are
Listen, Amy.
my
Listen,
hot
Amy.
takes.
I can tell we're going to be lifelong friends because kindred spirits. When I ask you a question, the first thing that you talk about is food because that's the same with me. So right back at you. Anyway, Amy Albertson,
Yeah.
once again, has been just an absolute pleasure, and we're going to leave it right there. We want to thank you so much for joining us here on IsraelCast, and we will indeed have info about Amy on the show notes page of our website, jnf.org/IsraelCast. And before we move on to housekeeping, I'd like to remind you that Jewish National Fund USA believes the time, as we've been talking about, has indeed come for us to reclaim the narrative and take ownership of the word Zionism and show the world how beautiful, inclusive, and inspirational Zionism really is. So do join JNF, Jewish National Fund USA's Conversations on Zionism, Reclaiming the Narrative. It's a whole year-long program which will educate, engage, and inspire on the true meaning of the word Zionism, as we've said, and reclaim its true meaning in all of its glory. Do go to youtube.com/Zionism Studios for more. Hope you got that. youtube.com/Zionism Studios for more. And of course, if you're a regular listener, you do know that we do release new episodes of the show every other Wednesday. And just so you never miss an episode, subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. Simply search for IsraelCast. How easy is that? And don't forget to rate and review us to make it easier for more people around the world to find us. Or you can always enjoy the show by visiting us at our website. Once again, it's jnf.org/IsraelCast. Now, it takes a whole moshav to put IsraelCast together. For that, we thank Vivian Grossman, Dara Shapiro, and Olivia Schendel. Our editors are Jay Rothman and James Casada from Miratone Studios, right here in the very heart of New York City. And the music that you hear at the top until the program is titled My Eden. It's by the very talented Rafi Malkiel from his album Water on the Tzaddik label. Now, IsraelCast is indeed powered by Jewish National Fund USA, your voice in Israel. For more information about JNF USA, visit jnf.org. And if you'd like to write to us with story ideas or just to say howdy, we'd all love to hear from you. So do email us at israelcast@jnf.org. Meantime, I'm Stephen Shalowitz, thanking you for tuning in and looking forward to having you join us on future episodes of IsraelCast.